In a world ruled by evil lived an ordinary girl, a girl destined for greatness with a heart of gold. She was shy and spent her days in the library out of the spotlight, acquiring A after A, tucking them away into her desk drawer, daydreaming of the moment when her excellence would be recognized. Until she began organic chemistry. As hard as she worked, and as much time as she spent hunched over her notebook on the third floor of the library, repeating and trying to wrap her mind around the mile-long mechanisms written on the whiteboard, she just couldn't get the hang of it. She hung her head low and strongly contemplated throwing everything that she had worked for away and heading down a new path. Until one day her life was turned upside down. Her grandmother had spoken of legends of evil, attacks on the innocent by cruel, heartless maniacs. The legends told of a chosen one, someone capable of ridding the world of evil once and for all. No one thought that the day would come when the prophecy was fulfilled, but as the days grew colder and the attacks on harmless civilians worsened, the world looked for a hero. Meanwhile, this ordinary girl didn't have time to worry about the world around her. She was so caught up in her own whirlwind of problems, she didn't even have time to recognize the problems and hardships circling around. She was entirely oblivious until it hit her right in the face. A single raindrop struck her on her nose as she wandered, given up and hopeless. The rain picked up and forced her into the closest building nearby, a chemistry lab. At this point in time, this is the last place that she wanted to be. She was shaken as she moved through the lab, being reminded of her hardships and failures. She dried off her face and lowered her rolled-up sweatpants, since even though she wasn't performing an experiment, she was in the lab, and those were the rules. The lab was colder than usual. Don't get me wrong, the lab always feels like it should house a family of polar bears, but today felt different. It was a deep, full-body cold that would make even Santa shake in his boots. She gazed out the window, watching the rain, praying for it to stop. It was then that she felt something move. She was not alone. Her eyes darted from side to side. She picked up the closest object nearby to protect herself, still unaware of what she was dealing with. This was the moment when she was suddenly face to face with the darkness that her grandmother had spoken about. All of that evil that she had avoided and ignored by keeping herself behind books and selfishly focusing on herself alone had broken past her literary boundary. There was no hiding anymore. She hid, brainstorming ways to get out of the situation safely. She thought back on the bedtime stories that her grandmother had told her about this infamous evil. She remembered legend of a warrior distracting the evil with a riddle, buying himself enough time to evacuate every man, woman, and child in the local village. However, as the warrior returned to the empty village, the darkness had solved the riddle. It knew now that a newspaper was black, white, and red all over, and it was not happy about the warrior's use of homophones. The warrior was attacked, fighting for his life. The darkness seemed to have no weakness. It wasn't until years later when a sample of darkness was caught and it was found that its only weakness was mesodibromosilbene. Like Superman's kryptonite, the darkness was unable to live in the presence of the chemical compound. Of course, there were only legends, but it seemed like her best shot. Although she was grateful to have the opportunity to be in a chemistry lab for this situation, there were parts of her that would have rather fought the darkness with no chance of winning than perform an organic chemistry experiment. She had incorrectly performed this experiment the previous week when it was being graded, but she decided to take a leap of faith anyways and go for it. She scribbled down the only riddle that she knew on a piece of scrap paper that someone had failed to clean up after their lab section and threw it in the darkness's direction as she sprinted to Hood 8. To clarify, she fast walked. She didn't run in the lab. She knew how important her safety was, so she tied her hair back. She wore gloves and goggles, even when beginning the experiment under these special circumstances. She began her experiment of brominating stilbene using hydrogen peroxide and hydrobromic acid by obtaining a 100 milliliter round-bottom flask, greasing the opening, and dropping a still bar into the flask. 0.5 grams of stilbene was then combined with 15 milliliters of ethanol and transferred into the flask. She simultaneously set up a hot water bath, placing the hot plate on a jack and the hot water bath on the hot plate. A reflux condenser was attached to the greased round bottom flask, and this attachment was secured by clasps and positioned above the hot water bath so that the liquid in the flask was fully submerged in the water. Once the reactants had dissolved, 0.8 milliliters of HBr were added to the mixture, which was heated and stirred in the reaction. 0.8 milliliters of hydrogen peroxide was then added dropwise, which changed the color of the solution from colorless to a golden yellow color. She waited patiently, brainstorming more riddles just in case the darkness was able to solve hers. The flask was removed once cooled, and NaCO3 was added to neutralize its pH, which was then checked by pH paper. This flask was then submerged in an ice bath in order to allow the crystals to form. She used a vacuum filter to isolate the crystals and then allowed them to dry. This was it. She had done it. Just as she was about to pick up the crystals, the darkness solved the riddle. Realizing that a cold can be caught but not thrown made the darkness angry, and it began to fast walk in the direction of the hood. The solid, crystallized product was able to be picked up as the darkness chased her out of the lab and down the hall. She began to gain confidence since she knew that she had completed her reaction correctly, and that she was fulfilling the infamous prophecy. She was the chosen one. She turned on the darkness and fought for her life and the lives of those that she loved. With one good hit, the darkness retreated, knowing that it had lost. She chased it until it was so winded that it had to stop, and with one swift throw, she released her generated meso-dibromostilbene in the face of darkness. The darkness fell to the ground, defeated. All was won. All was right.